Conference. Looking ahead, views from past, current, and upcoming presidency. I would request Chair and the panelists to please join us on the dais. I would like to welcome the chair and the panelists for this session. The session is chaired by Ambassador Suresh K. Reddy, Joint Secretary, MER, Ministry of External Affairs, Government of India. In panelists, we have His Excellency Dr. Saud Mohammad Al Sati, Ambassador of Saudi Arabia to India, Minister Ken Hussain, Economic and Development, Embassy of Japan in India, His Excellency Daniel Chuburu, Ambassador of Argentina to India. I'll request Chair to please take over the session. Thank you very much.
Thank you. For the benefit of all my friends in the hall and as well as here, you may be wondering why am I sitting here. I thought I'll just introduce myself. Till recently, I was the ambassador to ASEAN based in Jakarta. And subsequently, after coming to headquarters to the ministry, I'm now handling what we call multilateral economic relations, which also includes G20 and WTO and etc. other related areas. And in that capacity, I'm also the sous Sherpa for G20. And so I've been traveling to Tokyo, participating in the meetings. And prior to that, I was in Buenos Aires also attending the last summit, the G20 summit. But I must confess that I think the knowledge which is available in the floor is certainly maybe 100 times much higher than what would be available here. So it would be more of us benefiting from your views and experiences on how we should look at G20 going forward, really speaking. Because the theme today is fundamentally about past, present, and future of the G20. But when we look at it, the issue which is confronting us is exactly as summed up in the theme of today's conference, inclusive growth. Has G20 really achieved that fundamental objective? It started as an institution, as a grouping, to handle a certain set of crises. But in the process, the focus was also more on economic-related areas. The issues the issues relating to globalization was again in the economic sphere, much more than the social sphere. And it was subsequently, it was in 2011, I think, when France took up the theme of food security, which was kind of different from the ongoing themes. And after that, subsequently in 2015, when the Paris Climate Accord and the UN SDGs were adopted, then we started seeing really kind of a sharper focus on these areas within the G20 itself. That is one. Now, we also see the one area of criticism of the G20 has been traditionally that it has been more focused on the developed countries. And it has not really addressed the needs of the developing countries, even though the majority of the members of G20 are developing countries, which is, I think, about 11 out of the 20 are developing countries. So that has been one important area of criticism of G20's approach to global economic management, to put it in very simplistic terms. So going forward, I guess that would be one area, again, which we would need to look at. And insofar as today's discussion is concerned, in a nutshell, there have been a few consistent areas of focus in all the G20 presidencies by virtue of the fact that it is a body which is focusing on the global economic architecture and the status of the world. So as to say, so under that perspective, you would have seen some of the recurring themes would be, the dimensions of globalization on the economic front, as I mentioned, the stability, resilience of the financial systems, international trade, and again relating to finance, like in terms of crime, corruption, accountability, etc. And also kind of developing the national development framework, the national development agenda, to suit the needs of the global economic growth also. And in addition to these common trends, we also had some country-specific themes which came up, A. And B, also there were some issues which came to the prominence depending upon what was happening in the world at that time. Like, for example, when the Ebola crisis happened, we had the issue of pandemics, which figured quite prominently. Similarly, when the issue of ISIS was there, we again had terrorism coming to the forefront. Subsequent to the ISIS, we had the major crisis of refugee and the migration. So again, that came into forefront. That is where you find the various statements are issued. And in this context, I would really like to also compliment, Argentina. For the first time, they brought, I would say, adequate focus on the issue of future of work. They recognize the need has come for us to work jointly on this, and the time has come for our leaders to focus even more on this. And so one of the unique initiatives which Argentina had taken was having the combined meeting of the labor ministers, the education ministers, and also the it was a meeting of the three ministers who were relating to the future of work. One was labor, second was second was employment, and third, maybe the ambassador would help me out here.
Education, and skill development. Yeah.
They were the priority areas. It's there in the joint communique. Sorry, I forget the third minister who was there. And now, in the current presidency, of course, I mean, Mr. Kenko Sone, the Minister in charge of economic from the Japanese embassy, who would be briefing more about the current presidency. And Ambassador from Saudi Arabia, His Excellency Mr. Saud Mohammad Al Sati, would be speaking about the future, the incoming presidency of G20. While Ambassador Chubru, the Argentinian ambassador, will be speaking of their experience with G20. And insofar as the future is concerned, maybe later I will be willing to take it up. And now I'll give the floor to, should I say the past, Ambassador Daniel Chubru, to say a few words.
Thank you so much.
The sequence would be, should we say, past, present, and future?
Yeah.
So that it's easy for everybody.
Thank you so much. It's very difficult to be the past. But well, we have to recognize that it was the past presidency. When G20 met in Buenos Aires last year, it was the 10th anniversary of the first Washington meeting of the G20. So it was a good time to take a little balance and see how the effectiveness of the forum was for global macroeconomic coordination and governance. We were very proud to have the opportunity to show our commitment to international cooperation, multilateralism, and global governance. From the Argentine perspective of the G20 during 2018, we endeavored to seek different instances for dialogue among the members. It's good to remember that our main theme of the presidency was building consensus for fair and sustainable development. And out of that, there were three pillars, and one of the pillars, as the ambassador had just mentioned, was exactly the one on future of work. The other one was sustainable food future and infrastructure for development. So in that regard, we tried to build, as our main theme showed, agreement within the framework of the working groups, and inspired by the inputs and suggestions of international organizations and every other stakeholder that participates in the meeting. Not simply replicating the views, but trying to build on those views. The result of this exercise was reflected in the leaders' communique, and as I told last year when we were the current and not the past, we were very keen on having a leaders' communique that was a little shorter and reflected the consensus that was developed that we were able to develop within that group. Our experience was that even very sensitive issues at that time we were able to get something that represented a little step forward, and that some progress was made, and those were particularly the areas of trade and climate change. It was a great opportunity for us to build on that development, and we think that we were able to achieve that understanding. As we said before, we had these three main issues in which we were working to get the overall arching theme that we proposed, and we hope that many of these issues will be kept in the agenda and will be forward developed by next presidencies. Taking into account that the G20 is a dialogue mechanism between governments which does not have a formal bureaucratic structure, all presidents must keep cohesion and continuity on the items of the agenda. And this is why we have two agendas mainly in every work, which is a little bit the agenda, the heritage agenda, the agenda of the past, and the new themes that are proposed by the different presidency. It was our case in that we took many of the issues that were a priority in the German agenda in 2017, and we are very thankful that Japan will continue with many of the initiatives this year that were taken that year. Japan has presented a series of priorities that reflect this continuity and innovation of the topics. We welcome the importance given by Japan to critical issues such as global economic growth, quality infrastructure, global health, and digital economy, seeking to promote a free and open, inclusive and sustainable human-centered future society. In addition, we thank the Japanese presidency for the continuity of a dialogue to seek concrete progress on the need to reform the WTO so that it can face current and future trade challenges, as agreed by the G20 leaders in Buenos Aires last year, bearing in mind the views and needs of both developing and developed countries, as well as the continuity of work on infrastructure for development, energy transition, and a cross-cutting approach through the whole G20 agenda for the women's empowerment, among others. The G20 is a major player and a perfect place to have discussion on all major global issues, and also for public policy coordination. It is with this idea that we shall cooperate in every way to make, through the different G20 presidencies, a contribution to that goal. And particularly this year, we should work collectively to make the Japanese G20 presidency a successful one. Thank you very much, and as a little sum up of this, we were very happy on the results of the G20. It was a great experience for the country, and I think that we were able, through the communique that we produced, that we were able to have a little step forward in our goal, and in our common goal of having sustainable development and the role of developing countries, particularly in that. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I do not propose to summarize, since we all heard him, and I'll now request Minister Kenko Sone to please share your thoughts.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Kenko Sone. I'm Economic Minister at the Embassy of Japan. I'm also a career diplomat, so maybe in the contents of the issues, maybe you are much better than me, and so I don't go into so much details about each issues, but I'd like to talk a little bit about the issue that we would like to focusing this year. Of course, it's the continuation of the discussion. So following up the results of our previous summit in Buenos Aires, and to follow those issues and dealing with global economic challenges. Well, I myself, although I'm a career diplomat, I somehow dealing with economic issues several times. I've been posted in Washington, D.C. dealing with economy, and I was in Geneva dealing with trade. And also at the beginning of the G20 process, I was also in the Economic Bureau in the Foreign Ministry. So I was involved in that process for about 2 years. So I remember that the beginning of this G20 is dealing with this financial crisis in 2008. But it's been really developing. Well, in order to maintain this sustainable economic growth, we also have to think what sort of the measures we have to take in various areas, not only economy, but also, in a sense, the social issues as well. This year, Japan will host the summit meeting, which is a little bit different timing with when we used to have. Our summit meeting will be in June 28th and 9th in Osaka. Normally, the summit is supposed to have toward the end of the year, so that we can summarize every ministerial meetings or working groups to bring together to the leaders. But I don't know the reason and the details, but somehow we decided to have this summit meeting on June. And we will have several other ministerial meetings in between and before and after. So we already have the agriculture ministers meeting in May, and we'll have the finance ministers and the central bank governors meeting on 8th and 9th. And also at the same time, we will host a ministerial meeting on trade and digital economy. The first finance ministers meeting in Fukuoka, and the trade and digital economy ministers meeting in Tsukuba in Ibaraki Prefecture. So for the Indian government, it may be a little challenge to prepare for those meetings since you just have a new ministers today. But I hope those ministers can really join and have a fruitful discussion in Japan as well. So after the summit, we also have the labor and development ministers meeting, which the issue that the Argentina has put very much emphasis on. So we will follow up that one at the ministerial level as well. And we also have the health ministers meeting in October, and tourism ministers in October as well. Well, I think that Japan has been really emphasis on the tourism as well. Of course, we want more people to come to Japan for tourism. But I think in the economic development, various countries, tourism is one aspect to boost your economy. So we would like to have a good meeting in tourism as well. And then since the summit is in middle of the year, we are trying to have a foreign ministers meeting in the end of this year, which is in November 22nd and 3rd in Nagoya. So we are hoping maybe this foreign ministers meeting will be, in a sense, to closing or wrapping up what really discussed in the whole year. Especially after the summit meeting, based on the instruction of the leaders, we will finish our presidency by the end of this year. And then we would like to succeed to the Saudi Arabia to follow this G20. Then as for the priorities that for the Japan or the Osaka G20 Osaka Summit, I think the overall theme of Osaka Summit, as Ambassador of Argentina mentioned, that the free and open, inclusive and sustainable, human-centered future society. That is our Prime Minister emphasized as the overall theme to deal. And so I would like to have 3 points for the priority that Japan take. As a matter of fact, yesterday our Prime Minister had a speech in Tokyo. He attended one of the international conference called the Future of Asia. He talked about this preparation for the G20 summit. So he also have the 3 points which is a little bit different from I prepared, but it also covers everything that I'm going to explain. So I hope it will works. First one is the sustainable economic growth and of the global economy. Of course, the G20 is the premier forum for the international economic cooperation. So we have to assess the current economic situations and discuss how to prevent any downturn risks. And we always have to be very vigilant and need to be ready to respond effectively whenever some worst case is happening, as well as to make efforts to remove existing uncertainties. I hope that you already discussed several of those issues in your several panels. So I'm not going to in details in each issues, but of course, it's the economic situation still much better than when that economic crisis happened in 2008. But there are several risks and concerns we have to tackle. In the one of the main that we have to issue that we have to tackle is of course the trade and the environment. These are the keys for the sustainable growth. And the G20 always emphasizes the importance to fight against protectionism and against the market distorting trading practices. The issue has been really developed dynamically. It's sometimes difficult to deal, but we continue to tackle, especially we also believe that the WTO plays a very important role, as I personally posted in Geneva dealing with WTO negotiations and especially like the dispute settlement procedures are the very important aspect for the WTO has to be functioned. So we need a good WTO reform. WTO reform is very important priority for the discussion in Osaka. Of course, G20 is not the negotiating forum, but I think those leaders will provide a strong political impetus for the WTO reform, so that the WTO can be more functioning very well. Of course, in the current economic share is really changing, and this changing economic trends and the trading environment, especially for the issue of the e-commerce, is the one I think Japan will tackle at the G20 summit this year. And other than this WTO reform or trade issues, we would like to also discuss the women's empowerment. Women's empowerment is remains a key priority, especially for Japan. We've been dealing with, I know, for Japan, since the country, our aging society, we want more women to be working and having more jobs. We have several issues to tackle within Japan, but also this is the issue that the other most of countries is also facing. So that women's empowerment is a very important aspect we would like to discuss. We also have the population aging issue. Japan is really aging society, and but maybe it looks like it's the challenge, or I mean the problems, but I think we would like to make it as a chance for even the elderly people can contribute to our worker society, to work and contribute to society. And the second big topic will be the efforts to address global challenges. We will discuss all sort of the global issues, including climate change and energy transition, global health, and marine plastic litter, anti-corruption, immigration and migration issues, development agenda, enumerated into the Sustainable Development Goals. I don't go in each details, but some of them I'd like to mention. First one is SDGs. We would like to have a good discussion in SDGs, and we are annually updating the implementation, contributing so we can contribute to the high-level discussion UN in September. And as for the development, we really emphasize on the quality infrastructure. And then this quality infrastructure is also including the resilient infrastructure, which the Indian government is also put very much emphasis on. So we would like to seek to elaborate a set of the principles of this quality infrastructure, including the transparency, openness, economic efficiency, in view of the life cycle cost and the debt sustainability. Those are the areas, the principles we would like to bring at the discussion in G20. And as for the global health, Japan is always a strong advocate of the universal health coverage. And when you talk about universal health coverage, how to finance this health issues is another challenge that we will like to discuss. So this time, during the Osaka summit meeting, we will also host the special joint ministerial meeting of the finance ministers as well as the health ministers to discuss this financing issues of the universal health coverage. So I hope this will also another good opportunity to discuss these challenging issues as well. And as for the global issues, we also tackled Africa. Africa development also remains a very important agenda. And Japan has been hosting a so-called Tokyo International Conference for African Development, TICAD. We'll have a 7th meeting in August this year. So I hope that the G20 discussion also bring good input to this TICAD 7 as well. And climate change is always a key component of discussion in G20, and Japan is always put the emphasis on the climate change, and we hope it's really difficult to sometimes have a consensus, but we would like to have a pragmatic debate to find a common ground for concrete actions. And lastly, on this global issues, we will pick up the marine plastic litter issues. Japan would like to set forth the effective in international measures to tackle marine plastic litters. And the third area is the technology innovation and the overarching themes. Well, I also attended yesterday's lecture by Professor Baldwin, so I don't have to go into details how the importance of this digital economy or digitalization or telemigration or globotics. But I think in this, innovation is very important, and this new technologies, ITs or AIs, IoTs, everything is connected through this internet. And then one of the key areas is that the data is flowing all over the world in the very rapid speed. But the policy levels, maybe it's really lagging behind. We don't have any good data governance. So the Prime Minister is very much keen to discuss to how to deal with this data transactions or the data governance. Prime Minister mentioned at the Davos meeting that the Osaka track is the title for dealing with data governance. So I think the key component concept is the free flow of data with trust. So we prefer to have the data be freely flowed, but we also have to very much care about the protection of the personal private informations and to how to data must not be dealt in the wrong way. So I hope this Osaka summit we will have a good discussion how to deal with data and to secure the data free flows without any distraction or misuse of those data. So I hope those issues, maybe it's so many things we have to discuss at the summit, but I hope that those leaders will give us a good guidance for us to tackle those issues to a better human society. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was quite a comprehensive overview, I should say. It's very interesting what he mentioned. He referred to Prime Minister Abe's speech at Davos. And for those who have not read it, I would urge that you should read it. That was the starting point of my understanding of what Japan was planning to do during the presidency. And subsequently, he also mentioned about the DFFT, the data free flow with trust. That is going to be an important area of focus for us, especially for India. And this is going to continue in the upcoming presidencies also, this area of focus. I'll come back to that later in the future remarks on the future. Please, Ambassador, could I invite you?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Ambassador Reddy, for your kind introduction, and I am pleased to be here once again and join you for this annual G20 conference. And I thank the team from iCareer for organizing this very important event. I regret that I couldn't join the earlier sessions of this very important event because of some work commitments, but from my experience in the last event, which was held a few months ago, I really found it very, very useful and very educating about G20 and its works. It gives me a pleasure to be part of this panel, along with my colleagues, Ambassador Daniel Chiporo of Argentina and Mr. Cinco Son from the Embassy of Japan. Together we represent our countries, which comprise the G20 Troika of past, current, and future G20 presidencies. I would like to talk about what the G20 has achieved and why this collaboration still matters today. I will also speak briefly about our preparations for the G20 2020 presidency in Saudi Arabia. Gives me also pleasure to begin by commending India's role and contribution to the G20 efforts and works. India has always played an active role in this key global economic forum by bringing the perspective of a fast-growing emerging market, as well as in shaping the G20 reform agenda to build strong, sustainable, balanced, and inclusive growth. In more recent times, India has taken on a greater leadership role across the G20, and this will only grow with India set to assume the G20 presidency in 2022, as announced by Prime Minister Narendra Modi late last year. Of course, Saudi Arabia and India have a close and productive relationship in the G20 and bilaterally. Our countries enjoy friendly ties founded on our cultural and geographic proximity and shared interests. Indeed, bilateral trade between the two countries exceeded $27 billion in 2018, and it is set to grow even further this year. Saudi Arabia has an interest in supporting India's growth, as evidenced by our pledge to invest $100 billion in opportunities in India. And we have also common ground across many of the G20 agenda topics, such as promoting development, financial inclusion, creating quality jobs, jobs, investment in infrastructure, among other areas. The G20 provides an excellent platform for Saudi Arabia and India to strengthen this collaboration together with all G20 members. The G20, as you know, was formed at a time when the world was facing a global economic crisis. As a forum, it represents more than 80% of the global GDP and almost 2/3 of the world's population. The G20 Summit is formally known as the Summit on Financial Markets and the World Economy, meets on an annual basis to discuss the global financial situation, its challenges, and to deliberate on its solutions. The summit includes participation from developed and emerging market economies, and every year a broad range of guest countries and representatives from other international forums are invited. Therefore, we can say that as a forum, it is well represented across the main regions of the world. At the same time, the G20 remains agile. The forum is small enough to be responsive and act fast in times of crisis. This is backed by the fact that in 2008-2009, when there was a global financial crisis, the forum was responsible for stabilizing the financial markets and was able to launch a large fiscal stimulus program. It was able to avert the possibility of global economic depression. The G20 members significantly increased the resources of the IMF and multilateral development banks. They also put in place financial regulatory reforms aimed at preventing another crisis. As the global economy stabilized, the G20 put in place the framework for strong, sustainable, and balanced growth, which evolved to include the 2 in 5 target to lift global GDP by 2% over 5 years. Over the time, G20 members also considered further socio-economic and governance issues. Members agreed to reduce the gap in participation rates between men and women by 25% by 2025. It is estimated that this initiative will bring more than 100 million women into the labor force. To achieve this, Women 20, an official G20 engagement group forming a transnational network of women's organizations, female entrepreneurs, associations, and think tanks, was formed. They further agreed to reduce the share of young people being permanently left behind in the labor market by 15% by 2025. More recently, the G20 has begun to address challenges such as making the most from the disruption caused by the digital economy, as well as the focus by Japan on promoting a human-centered future society. Finally, the G20 has continuously supported the UN Development Agenda. These are just some of the G20 achievements to date, which indicate that G20 consensus, though often not easy to achieve, has the potential to deliver meaningful results. Saudi Arabia has, of course, been part of these decisions. The Kingdom has supported important G20 initiatives such as the Global Infrastructure Hub and Women Entrepreneurs Finance Initiative. And despite the current challenges facing multilateralism, global cooperation remains important. The world today is becoming more interconnected, and increasingly digital in nature. This can be seen in how we conduct business. Global financial markets have become more interlinked. Therefore, the G20 members face common challenges which necessitates collaboration and cooperation. This is also true for Saudi Arabia and its Vision 2030, reforms which will rely on global cooperation. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia will assume the G20 presidency on December 1st, 2019. We will announce our full presidency agenda at that time. The 2020 Leaders Summit will be held on 21st, 22nd November, year 2020 in Riyadh. And in the meanwhile, we are working to support Japan and prepare for the June Osaka Summit. Our 2020 presidency will aim to consider the greatest economic challenges of the world and deliver practical solutions where the G20 can add significant value. Consistent with the previous presidencies, our agenda will aim to include financial, economic, and social issues, including energy, environment, climate, digital economy, trade, agriculture, healthcare, and education. The summit will further aim to develop effective policies to achieve sustainable and balanced development and create job opportunities. The Kingdom further has an important role to bring the perspective of the Middle East and North Africa region and the Arab and Muslim worlds. And we will endeavor to bring this perspective to the forum. We look forward to demonstrating the diversity and potential of our region, including our young population, rich cultural heritage, and natural resources. Issues such as women empowerment, promotion of trade, and investment cooperation will be on the agenda as well. Building on these successes of previous presidencies, Saudi Arabia will work with stakeholders to build consensus for the benefit of the world and the world economy. In the run-up to the summit, Saudi Arabia will host preparatory meetings, including ministerial and senior government officials, as well as meetings for representatives from the private sector and civil society. We are currently designing our G20 program in close consultation with members and other stakeholders, and this iCareer conference presents another opportunity for us to engage and listen. And hence, I am very grateful to be here today with you. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. I'd also like to especially thank you for sharing how Saudi Arabia is proposing to approach its upcoming presidency. That was a very useful briefing, Ambassador. Thank you so much. And of course, for earlier words of kind words relating India's role and also words on support to India. You know, insofar as the remarks made were concerned, there are basically three specific aspects which I'd like to take. One is that what distinguished Ambassador from Argentina had mentioned, that during their presidency it was a commitment to multilateralism which they wanted to show. And in the case of Japan, primarily it would be a continuation of the ongoing discussions in sense of continuity of the agenda. And third, what Ambassador of Saudi Arabia mentioned, that they are going to be approaching it from the perspective of the MENA region and as well as from the Islamic world. These are very important because these are the areas which we also need to address going forward. When you look at going forward, there are a few areas which we need to consider. One, what should be the priority from an emerging economy perspective? Because what is interesting is that, as yesterday the Secretary DA was also mentioning, that 22 it will be India, then 23 it would be Indonesia. They have already indicated their interest. And 24 and 25 likely, Saudi Arabia and maybe Brazil, not yet confirmed, but likely. So in which case you're going to have South Africa and Brazil. So in which case you're going to have a continuity of the agenda, and importantly a continuity of a perspective from emerging economy perspective, which is going to be the theme. So here, when you look at it, the question comes, so what should be the focus areas from our perspective, from India's perspective, starting with India, so to say, on which naturally I'd like to invite your opinions, your ideas, anything which you would be willing to share would be very useful for us, one. And because not only useful to us, but it also feed into the upcoming presidency of Saudi Arabia. They would also be very happy to receive your suggestions and ideas. Why is this important is also the fact that when you look at the G20, the knowledge bank is primarily OECD. And so by virtue of OECD being the knowledge bank for G20 over the years, it was a knowledge bank and is the knowledge bank for the G7. And from G7, when G20 was established, then naturally OECD became the knowledge bank primarily for the G20 process. So naturally, many of their approaches are more towards the developed countries, so to say. And in this context, number one is that I would like to certainly invite more papers, more inputs from the think tanks in the emerging markets, in the developing countries. There's really a very much need of that, especially considering that next 4 years they're going to be critical in terms of shaping a long-term agenda. And second, when you look at the G20 itself, we also need to discuss and see how do we encourage G20 to focus more on emerging markets, emerging economies. That is a challenge which you are going to face, because it is true that since the G20 was established at a summit level, the number of developing countries have been quite high, in the sense 11 versus 9. I mean, it's not really versus 9, but 11 against 9. But the focus has not been so much on the emerging economies, really speaking. So how do we address this imbalance? How do we encourage them to look at the emerging markets in a much, emerging economies in a much more focused manner? And third is also the biggest challenge is that when you look at the consistency of agenda, which is very much understandable because it was more on the finance track. When it comes to a finance track, broadly, okay, you are able to attain policy coordination. You are able to work together. You are able to, because the common objective was there, which is global financial stability, right? Essentially. So that was very much understandable. But then, when you introduce the socio-economic challenges, that is where you start finding the divergences in terms of approach. And unfortunately, the divergences seem to be increasing. And broadly, the 4 areas of divergence which you would find as we go forward would be, one would be as, in the case of the digital economy or technology-related areas, there is going to be sharp divergence because, as you're already aware, there's a belief that we are the end user in terms of the numbers, so we should get the benefit as an asset. But at the same time, the countries where these big tech companies are based, their approach is different. I'm just putting it in very ordinary terms. And then B is set on trade. You're already seeing that how does the G20 gain its legitimacy? It gained its legitimacy by virtue of being 80% of the global economy or 75% of the global trade. But at the same time, where does the difference emerge? It's on trade. And so how far is it going to continue? Is it the beginning of trade-related tensions? And are you going to see an end, or is it going to be just a starting point with it only increasing? Because it's also related to how the economies are going to be performing. When we increasingly say that there's a global slowdown because of trade tensions, because of related whatever, and then we find that as the economy shrinks, then naturally the tendency is more to increase a protectionist kind of an approach. So it kind of becomes a negative spiral rather than enabling you to go forward. Now, in this context, the biggest challenge is that how do we manage these differences within the G20 process and ensure that we're able to address the global challenges rather than allowing those challenges to impact G20 per se. And I do believe that going down the line, the challenges are going to be that much more, because increasingly you find that countries are getting used to the idea of following a narrow approach. And you look at, for example, what is happening in EU. You look at the recent elections in the EU. It's more of the parties which are more oriented towards a narrow approach, which seem to be winning the elections. I look at in many other countries in the world, it's a similar kind of an approach which seems to be acceptable to the public at large. And so in turn, naturally, the policy space available for the leadership is also shrinking. And this is a challenge which I feel we are going to be increasingly confronted with down the line. And I do believe that we need to look at it seriously in terms of how do we manage it within the G20 also. And coming back to as I mentioned, what could be the focus areas? I mean, we did some exercise in-house, and some of the areas we found was like on energy security, of course, naturally financial stability from the perspective of the debt sustainability also importantly, which yesterday was mentioned. The WTO naturally, then corruption-related areas. Another important area would be terrorism, because the recent developments have shown us that it's very much alive, and it has really gone beyond the borders and borders of any country, so as to say. And it would need greater focus and greater cooperation and coordination within the G20 itself. And again, as a country with a large labor force which is stationed outside, naturally the portable social security schemes will become important from our perspective. And then disaster resilient infrastructure. And importantly, implementation of the Paris Accord in terms of also extending support to the developing countries to adapt to the technologies. Food security, oil price volatility, etc. These are some of the broad themes which we were looking at. But I would really welcome your thoughts from the floor. The biggest challenge which I see is whether this issue of multilateralism versus unilateralism, how much more is it going to dominate the discourse within the G20 also? Because it's increasingly dominating. For example, in the case of WTO, it's very much evident, and when you look at in the UN also, it is there. But it's not yet come into G20 because it has been primarily focusing on the finance and economy-related areas. But as I said, down the line, when we start looking at other areas, say, for example, as we start feeling the impact of climate change, whether it is going to be impacting the discourse within the G20 also much more sharply is something which we need to see. Thank you. With these few words, please. I'll also like to invite Mr. Amar Bhattacharya to share his thoughts, since you have been associated with the G20 process for many years, in terms of what could constitute the priorities for the emerging markets, emerging economies. Please.
Thank you, Ambassador. So, first of all, it's really great to have such a panel, because one might think of differences, but one hears a lot of actually accord in what has been said across the three. So I think, of course, I come from an emerging market, but I have been a Sherpa in the G7 process, so I have seen both sides, and I would say that one of the positive developments now I see, even as I look at this year's G7 agenda, is that there's actually complementarity between these different spheres. And so rather than, I would say, just emphasize the differences, it's actually good to find commonalities of space. And Japan is putting special emphasis, for example, on ocean and ocean waste, as is the G7 at Biarritz. So there are good commonalities to be exploited. Having said that, what I do think is true is that emerging markets often come at issues from, not that the issues are different, but in the same issues there are differences of interests and positions. So I would say that maybe when it comes to even infrastructure or movement of people or technology or even robotics, etc., we might have differences of approach, and the G20 is good in terms of bringing together these different perspectives. I think in looking at, from the discussions of the last 2 days, I would say that there are some structural changes that are really kind of going to be very, very important in the coming period, which will require concerted action. To me, coming from where I come, I would say that the SDGs and the climate agenda have to be the North Star to drive, in some sense, collective, orientation. And the G20, I see as the preeminent group for implementation. The UN is very powerful in agenda setting, but the G20 has a comparative advantage in implementation and in setting leadership an agreement. And a good example is on climate change, or a good example, as you pointed out, is in the difficulties on trade. So the test of the G20 has to be as much how it is able to tackle some of the more difficult issues as it is to foster just action on things where there is broad agreement. And I certainly think that climate change, technology sharing, immigration, and trade are going to be amongst the set of issues that are more in the difficult realm. As far as India is concerned, I do think that we have to give particular attention to what is the future of jobs in a digitalized, globalizing world. And I think we have to give particular emphasis to how do we meet the huge needs for infrastructure and for human development.
Thank you. Could I request you also to identify yourself, please?
Yeah, my name is Raka Sinabal. I represent an NGO called Angaja Foundation. I don't know if this can be taken up by the G20, but it's something, it's two things among, well, many others, two things which are causing a lot of suffering in the world. One is ending the conflict in Yemen. That's one. And the second is the issue of the migrants from Africa, from other Muslim countries. You know, I mean, Europe gave them a helping hand to some extent, then that, you know, that sort of closed down. But really the Muslim world, I don't know how many other countries are, you know, members of G20, apart from Saudi Arabia. The Muslim world has just not, you know, given them a hand at all, when most of the migrants are Muslims. So I don't know, you know, these are very important issues where millions are suffering, but I don't know if a forum like G20 can take up these two very important issues. Thank you.
I should say that I have spent about 25 years in the Islamic world, including the Arab world. And I may slightly disagree with you in the sense that, in my view, I mean, I've really seen the Islamic countries coming forward to extend very generous help, you know, not only to the Muslim refugees, but also to the others, irrespective of the religion, really. In different countries, I've seen them coming forward to extend full support. But if Ambassador of Saudi Arabia would like to add a few words, he'll be very happy to hear. Thank you.
About immigration, poverty, challenges in the Arab and Muslim world, and also the question about Yemen. And you're right, the war in Yemen should be ended. And the way to end the war is to simply implement the international the UN Security Council Resolution 2116, which called specifically on the militia of Houthis to end their illegal occupation of the Yemeni government institutions, and called on the Houthi militias to stop recruiting and using children in the war, and to refrain from committing any action that might undermine the authority of the legitimate Yemeni government headed by legitimate and elected President Abdurrabbu Mansour Hadi. These are facts, and all what you need to do is just take a look at UN Security Council Resolution 2216. That resolution particularly also called on all states to refrain from providing military equipment to the militia of Houthis, and called on states to impose or implement that resolution in particular. Would like to remind you that Iran is the country that is violating that resolution. Iran is the country that is providing weapons to the Houthi militia, which caused the continuation of the war. Iran is providing militias with suicidal boats and drones that are being used in attacking civilian areas, airports, and oil facilities. Iran is providing Houthis with landmines that is being used against civilian and maritime security. And Iran is providing Houthi militias with ballistic missiles that have been used against cities in Saudi Arabia and against Yemenis in their towns and so on. So yes, the war should be ended, and the United UN Security Council resolution made a very clear way actually for ending the war, and we think the conflict should be ended based on UN Security Resolution 2216 and the initiative of the GCC countries and the outcomes of the Yemeni National Yemeni Comprehensive Dialogue. That's the way we see it. And Saudi Arabia and other partners in the Arab coalitions answered to the call of the legitimate president of Yemen to help restore stability in Yemen. Having said that, Saudi Arabia is the largest donors to Yemen. We have donated so far nearly $14 billion to help lift the suffering of the Yemenis because of the war, and because also the activities of the criminal activities of the Houthi militias that prevents the humanitarian assistance sent by Saudi Arabia, UAE, and other countries and international organizations to reach to the area that is under the control of this militia. But however, we are working closely with friends and allies and with the United Nations to ensure that humanitarian assistance get delivered to the areas, including areas under the Houthis, such as in Saada and other and in other Yemeni governorates. We are, neighbor to Yemen. They are our brothers, and they are allowed to come and work in Saudi Arabia. And we have nearly 2 Yemeni people who are working in the country and helping their families in Yemen, of course. As to the situation, humanitarian situation, and poverty and unemployment and so on in the Arab and Muslim world, what you said is correct, true, and these challenges have to be addressed. We have so many programs actually in which we extend economic support, financial support, developmental support to countries in the region, in the Arab world and in Africa and in other Asian countries. We established in 2015 a very important institution called King Salman Center for Humanitarian Relief Works, and it's implementing hundreds of programs. Some of them are educational, developmental programs in so many countries. But yes, there is a need for doing more, and we will continue to look at ways as how can we help provide assistance for development, because development creates jobs and helps stability and progress in any region. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. That was quite a comprehensive response. The Islamic Development Bank has been an important development partner for many countries. And I've attended some of the programs and projects, and so that's why I was mentioning it. But incidentally, within the G20 per se, yes, it has been figuring in sense of the issue of refugees and displacement. It has been figuring in the G20 discussions. And OECD also prepares an annual report to monitor the progress made in this field. So it is an ongoing work within the G20 itself. Thank you. Any other comments?
Yes, hi. I'm